for joining today's DoD Environmental Planning and Conservation webinar series. Series presentation. As a friendly and courteous reminder, today's presentation will be recorded and then posted on the Cultural Resources DenX website under News and Outreach. Today's presenter is Lys Perhay, a program manager at the Technical Center of Expertise for the Preservation of Historic Buildings and Structures. She will be discussing operation and maintenance training, a special program for historic buildings. Following the presentation, we will have time for questions. Before we get started, please take a moment to make sure your phones and web browsers are on mute. And with that, I will turn it over to Ms. Perhay.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. I really appreciate this opportunity to share everything that we do here at the Technical Center of Expertise for Historic Preservation. Apologies, one moment while I pull myself out of presentation mode so I can turn my camera on. Okay. So today I am really excited to share with you the operations and maintenance training we designed for West Point Military Academy. I wanted to kick it off a little bit about who we are. We are the Technical Center of Expertise for the Preservation of Historic Buildings and Structures. We are based out of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Seattle District offices. We're staffed by 5 Secretary of Interior qualified architectural historians and historic architects. And our mission is to be the technical lead advisory center on matters of the historic built environment within the agency's responsibility under the National Historic Preservation Act. So not only do we work in the Seattle, but we work across the United States and out of CONUS as well. We also work not only for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, but for other entities like the EPA. So we can pretty much work with any federal agency. We're here to partner and be a resource for historic preservation needs. We kind of work in 4 big buckets: documentation, evaluation, treatment, and planning. Education can fall under a number of these. Today we're going to be talking about that operations and maintenance training. So with that, we'll kick it off here. We were asked to come out last year by the West Point Cultural Resources Manager, Paul. And it was a 3-day training we developed. So day 1 was preservation basics. So creating a common language for everyone. In the afternoon, we went out on a walking tour and looked at common issues for the campus and then areas of success, right? So from the get-go, we are celebrating what they're doing well and getting everyone on the same page, creating a common language. Day 2 is a full classroom day. In the morning, we go over common maintenance requirements for historic buildings. And then in the afternoon, we go over integration of new systems. So that's things like fire sprinklers, HVAC, elevators, things that we commonly need to keep our campuses ready and usable. And then day 3, it's a half day. This is a key learning exercise. We recap everything that we've covered. And then we close it out with a field trip with a local expert to talk about what makes the place that they work and are stewards of special. So one of the goals of this training is to really get everyone who touches the operations and maintenance projects at the table, communicating clearly, and incentivize dialogue, right? Create a space where it's okay to ask questions. We are a team of teams, right? We are not all experts at the same thing. We are lucky to work with so many experts. So part of this exercise really focuses on making those local connections and creating that cross-departmental dialogue, which is really essential to making an operations and maintenance project work. So here you can see we kick every day off with the rules, repetition, setting the baseline, people come and go. In day one, we covered introductions, acronyms, preservation, what is a historic property, and what are character defining features. What guides we work with, right? We want to provide them additional educational tools, and then what do we want to see in the afternoon, right? So the read ahead for this course is a technical preservation brief, and then bringing ideas about what they want to see in the afternoon. So they come into this classroom with an understanding of some component of technical knowledge, and then also what they want to learn, right? We want to tailor this to meet local needs as much as possible. We don't want people just to sit there and provide them with information that isn't immediately relevant and tangible. So I have everyone kick it off with their name, their role, the technical preservation brief that they read right straight from the get-go, creating that culture of ownership, and then what they want to learn. Then we delve into acronyms, right? Preservation is a specialized language like so many other things. And in the DoD, we sure love our acronyms. So understanding all the words we're going to be using also helps create a safe space. So we start off with the common lists here. Then we move on to why the work is important to the mission, right? Preservation is a law, not a suggestion. Currently, there is 137 billion, B as in Bravo, dollars in deferred maintenance in the DoD, with an additional $91 billion in anticipated liability in the face of climate change. The DoD stewards 375,000 buildings, only 60,000 of which are surveyed and 20,000 of which have been determined to be eligible for the listing to the National Register of Historic Places, and 49 of those are National Historic Landmarks. So we have a lot of properties that we take care of. And then we also discuss what a historic property is. It's not just a building, right? It can be a road or a sidewalk or even a planning model. People always want to do the right thing, but they don't necessarily know, right? So this provides foundational knowledge. We also talk about the requirements, right? So a historic resource is something that's 50 years old or older. And then that 50-year mark jumps every single year, right? So creating an understanding that history isn't static, it's changing with us all the time. So right now, we've switched over, we're through urban renewal and into really cool like brutalist movements and stuff like that. So expanding people's idea of what a historic property is. And then helping them identify what a character defining feature is. If you don't know what's important to a structure, how are you going to know if you're harming it or not, right? So we go over the technical preservation brief, right? And this is a moment where I would ask if anyone has read this brief, because if someone has, we want to give folks an opportunity to continue to create that sense of stewardship, ownership, expertise, create local go-to personnel, right? So ideally, we would have some in the class that had read this and they would be able to raise their hand and help kick us off. So I like to tailor this to whatever installation we're on. So in this case, I focused on the National Historic Landmark District nomination, right? So providing these real world tangible results. I want people to walk out of every session with things they can immediately apply to the environment that they work in. So again, here, talking about character defining feature, I like to use masonry as an example. Right? This is a super common historic building material. We see it all across the United States, and it's a really great way to show the variations in character, right? So here we see different types of stones, different shape patterns, different grout patterns, right? Just getting people exposed to the concept of variation and character defining feature. And when I pull up this slide, as we kind of talk about it, I go into, you know, what I kind of go into like, I have them call out in the classroom what they're looking at, right? So now that they know what a character defining is, I would have folks raise, okay, so we see this here. What's a character defining feature of this building, right? It might be everything from the small footprint to the stones, to the window openings, to the doors, right? And we kind of work through piece by piece. So I don't want these lectures to be static. I want them to be interactive. And then in the afternoon before we leave, I typically have a list preloaded of buildings that we're going to look at for our walking tour. But we also want, now that we've started this conversation, if people have any additional ideas that they want to see or talk about, we have operations and maintenance staff there. We have PMs, we have real property. Whoever engineers, whoever this might be relevant to. And as the wheels start to churn, we can broaden this conversation. And ultimately, like I said, we want things that people are engaged about and applicable to the environment. So typically I use this lunch session on the first day to kind of flush out the afternoon tour map with the cultural resource manager or whoever is chosen to host this event. And then we go on a walking tour and we look at successes, areas of improvement. Areas of improvement I see a lot are, repointing is a big one on historic properties. West Point had some really fantastic ADA additions that they'd done really well. So we were able to go and look at that as a group and talk about what was well. We had some good and bad examples of flashing. And you'll see images from this tour throughout this day 2 presentation. So we also like to photograph while we're out and about on campus on that first day walkthrough, and then integrate the images so that, again, as we roll into day 2, we're still keeping it hyper local and relevant to these folks' needs. So day 2, we start off with a recap. Then we launch into repair and maintenance issues. So general historic building technology, masonry and mortar repair, roof repair, water infiltration, roof replacement, and window replacement. And then the afternoon is focused on new systems in old buildings. So, this is things like new penetrations for utilities, mechanical equipment, life, health, safety, elevators. But before we dive into that, we have a mini exercise where we work at creating cross-collaborative dialogue. So I'm going to go through day 2 now. This is the heavy classroom day, but everyone was a real trooper about it, and it went pretty well. So we talk about everything we recapped, right? So here's an image we took on the walkthrough. So why do we consider our effects to historic buildings? What are first-line repair methods? What's a historic resource? And how old does something have to be historic, right? And so I would have class members call out questions and answers where they could in this, again, trying to keep it interactive. So I kick it off with a general, kind of what's a historic building, right? And I like this example here. This is from a construction college in London. And it shows different cross sections of the floor. And I think what this does is it really iterates the differences in building technology over time. So the reason we have special considerations for historic buildings is because of the way the membranes of the building are built, 1930s and before versus today. So historic building membranes are a lot more breathable. The composite materials are not the same. Right. So when we repair them, a lot of our newer materials are so hyper engineered that they're actually harder and function very differently during, weather change events than the historic ones. So I kind of talk through this at a detailed level, right? So changes pre-1930, post-World War II, and then 1990 plus, where we start to get into passive buildings, hyper engineered systems, things like that. Just, again, creating that baseline knowledge so we're all speaking the same language as we roll into how we treat and repair. The why is really important, right? So masonry is always a hot topic. This is probably one of the 2 most common issues that I see on historic properties and installations. So we go into repair. We identify the types of damage we see. We're going to talk about cleaning, and then who to ask for advice, right? Pointing people to the CRM, or if you have a masonry expert in your shop, right? Getting them involved in this and identifying themselves as experts, as resources with open doors is really critical. So these, again, are images I took on the site walk, right, of issues that I was seeing. So when we look at a masonry unit, we go over what we're looking at, right? So size, material, color, texture. The first line when replacing masonry is picking out the right size stone. Then we look at the other character defining feature, right? So we're tying into the character defining feature conversation we had on day one. Mortar joints are a really critical part of this too. And looking at examples again out and about. So how can we tell when there's damage? We can see cracking. We see some new harder repairs that are creating failure at connection points to older masonry. And then things like efflorescence and staining too, right? So pointing out common issues we see, and then these are issues that we saw on our walk. So again, tying it to the local environment, making it immediately relevant. And then providing clear masonry cleaning guidance, the technical preservation briefs that go along with this. So again, asking if anyone's read them, providing the brief number, things like that. So working through standard process there. Another one I really like is to actually share mortar type mixes. Don't be afraid to do this. N-type mortar base is always a pretty safe bet unless you have, hand-formed non-kilned bricks. And so talking about that as a base, and then talking about, systemizing if you have common aggregate sizes you see in things or color, using that as a base and then figuring out how to create standard formulas and pigment mixes. This is something some installations have done that saves a lot of time and heartache down the road. Talking about repointing, a good repoint versus a bad repoint, right? What makes that happen? What does that look like? Talking about signs of water intrusion, so where we see that the most. So that upper image is a good example of where the repoint is harder than the masonry unit itself, and it's caused cracking and crazing while the grout stays firmly in place. And then vulnerabilities at transition points as well. And then we provide that technical preservation brief you can see up there at the top too in 39. Water intrusion, right? Climate change is impacting this, being based out of the Pacific Northwest. We get a lot of rain out here. And so this is near and dear to my heart. So talking about whole system management of water, right? It doesn't just start with at where the water's coming in. Usually it's tied to something else like flashing gutters, making sure roofs repaired, joints are properly caulked and sealed, painting, keeping stuff clogged, connecting your gutters, right? So identifying it's not just the single spot where we see the intrusion, but it's actually a whole system. And this is why I like to have folks from lots of different professions there as well, right? So we talk about it at different points on the buildings and likely causes and how to fix it. So windows and doors, groundwater, right? Engineering with nature is a really big concept right now. And I can't tell you how many times I've gone out to a site and the answer is make a bioswale and connect your gutters, right? So again, looking at holistic systems and how it ties into the installation and water resource management as a whole. Talk about wood window repair and replacement. This is another really common one I hear about. If you repoint if you properly repair a historic window, it can last for over 100 years. I don't know any vinyl product that can last that long. But we talk about proper methods for that, the elements of a window. The anatomy of a historic window is really, really different. And because it's oftentimes a mixed material point too, there's additional vulnerabilities around that. So we go over kind of the basics of that. An idea for a future addition to this training is to have people actually show and do presentations in real time as modules, as a way to kind of break it up and get folks some hands-on experience. So this is another place where you could potentially draw on local expertise in the shop. Oftentimes I find that there's a window or door expert. West Point had a really exceptional door expert. So talking about window replacement, right? Sometimes we have to replace the windows. Sometimes they're too far deteriorated, or we have security needs that, outweigh the character defining feature of the building, right? So this is always a balancing act. We do have guidance on imitative materials. Life, health, safety is ultimately our first goal, right? So, addition of blast proof windows, things like that. When possible, how do we make it sensitive? So keeping muntin patterns the same, profiles approximately the same, things like that. Color quality as well. So again, looking at the character defining features of a window, we would talk through this here, right? So it's the size of the opening, it's the number of muntins, it's where it's subdivided in the window. Again, providing real world examples. And then we can also see some good masonry repair to talk about down in the bottom of the image on the right. So going over that, the next one we talk about is roof. So I go over every category. I didn't keep them all in this slide deck for time's sake. But so slate roofs are a really common one that we see. So talking about sounding slate, it's not a material we use a lot now. It's more common on the East Coast than the West Coast, but so filling in that knowledge gap there. We talk about clay tile. This is one we see really commonly as well. The really great thing about military architecture and infrastructure is that there's a lot of standardization. So you don't always have to reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of really good problem solving that our partners on other installations have done. So by connecting installations, connecting with each other, we can oftentimes rely on each other's legacy knowledge to help solve problems. Metal roofs where it's appropriate, right? So this is an image of the historic horse barns out at West Point Military Academy. You'll note that the overall roof shape has stayed the same, but the roofing material itself has changed. Because there were so many additions and stuff, right? We're not so worried about this, especially in a utilitarian setting. Something like this can be more appropriate. So, and this actually ended up being determined not eligible, right? So also underlining that just because something is historic doesn't necessarily mean it's eligible. And so people shouldn't be afraid to identify that status, right? We want to be good stewards of the things that we have that are significant, but just because it's old doesn't necessarily mean it's important. Another one we talk about is composition shingles. So this is a very old stone house on West Point Military Academy. And you can see that composition shingles have been added to the roof, but the color, doesn't pop. It's not a green or a red, so it's pretty sympathetic. And then overall, the roof line has been maintained. Ultimately, when we talk about historic buildings, the healthiest ones are the ones that are consistently used, occupied, maintained. So that's a frontline goal as well, right? So I think it's worth celebrating anytime we keep buildings whole, occupied, waterproof, and safe. I would much rather have a composition shingle roof go in if that's what we can afford, as opposed to a slate one that would be more period appropriate if we can't afford the slate and we're going to have to wait a couple more years and have leaks come in, right? Because then it can become a structural issue. So again, that goes back to the conversation of deferred maintenance, right? Looking at things holistically. We talk a lot about imitative materials on roof. This is a great candidate for imitative materials. Just from a cost and availability perspective, this is a really common one that I see. So looking at that technical preservation brief for guidance, again, is a first line defense. Yeah. And then we go to lunch. I like to pull fun images from the Library of Congress and history to share with folks. So when we get back, we have our first exercise. I like to kick the afternoon sessions off just in case we have folks join. Oftentimes we have specialists like fire chiefs who have very busy schedules drop in for relevant sessions. So just restarting the process. It's never bad to take a minute to reiterate expectations and goals. So the first exercise is how do you create and implement maintenance projects? while we have everyone in the room and their undivided attention, you know, really identifying how we communicate this from the people that are putting in the orders to the O&M staff is different. Oftentimes there are multiple channels, right? And so clearly talking through and writing down what these processes are help everyone speak the same language and develop the same expectations going through that process, right? So do we put it through as a paper form or do we put it through online? How often do people get these? You know, how many are they seeing? Where are they coming in from? Who gets these on the O&M side and doles them out? Do you have experts you go to regularly? Things like this. And we write it all out stream of consciousness style. It should look like a beat poem when we're done with this, tacked up on the walls. It's big. And then, you know, who writes the scope? All of that. We want that all hashed out in there. And then we crack that egg and say, okay, what would you do to change it? Does this process need to be leaner? Do the O&M folks need more information? If so, what kind of information is this? And we do see that. So the comments we got here was that the system itself was good, the online submission system, but oftentimes the orders lacked specificity. It's like building 23, third floor women's bathroom leak. And it's like, okay, which toilet stall, right? Can you identify that it's coming from the base? Can you identify that it's coming from the top? Things like that. So just we were able to clearly identify from this exercise straight from the get-go what we needed from engineers, PMs, people who are submitting these orders to help O&M do their job well. You know, and this differs installation to installation. You know, Fort Leavenworth is one we've worked with on treatment, and they have a very different process than West Point. So they needed a really different thing. They needed an inspection checklist afterwards, right? So the answer is not going to be the same on this every time. Dive into imitative materials, which is one of the things people are most excited to learn about. And there are really great applications for imitative materials. Just because it's old doesn't mean it's good, right? We've learned this with asbestos. We've learned this with lead paint. Just because it was the previous solution doesn't mean it's the right solution now. And ultimately, again, warfighter life, health, safety is a huge consideration. And keeping the buildings occupiable and safe is also an additional one, right? Top level, that's what we want, along with legal compliance. So we use imitative materials when there's no other options available, which happens. We use it when it won't harm historic surrounding materials. When it'll have a proven substantial performance period. I remember when Hardy Plank first came out and the first gen stuff grew mushrooms in wet environments, right? It looked better than vinyl. It looked like an imitative wood. It was a composite. It should have been good, but instead it was a mushroom factory, right? So we don't use our historic properties as guinea pigs. We have the Construction Engineering Research Laboratory as part of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. They're a really great resource. You know, when you see issues commonly, you know, let me know, let them know. They have the capacity to research solutions for building technology, and they do a really great job at it. One study they put out that I particularly love is about flood resiliency in historic building materials, right? So degradation rates of like old growth lumber versus new. So, and then is it going to add value to have a composite material go in or an imitative material? So I love a Trex deck. That is a tested product in areas where we have high foot traffic. The pine of today is not the same as the old growth pine of the 1850s, right? It's not going to have the same durability or wear. The cost is going to be bonkers. So Trex is a really good candidate here, especially if it's a painted wood. So we talk about new systems as well, right? So plumbing, electrical, HVAC, these are all modern amenities we expect to see everywhere, and they're amazing. So These can often be pretty intrusive, and they're often classified as repairs, right? So flagging language, right? Repair can be super comprehensive. I've seen repair contracts come through that involve gut renovation of whole buildings, but it's classified as a repair because, you know, we leave the studs in place. So sensitivity to language, talking about plumbing. So the things we want to look at, right? Old pipes are not great. Unless you still have your copper. If you got any of that cast iron galvanized on the West Coast, we've even seen some cedar pipes in place. They have a limited shelf life, and they're things that have to be replaced regularly. So giving people the tools to do that well, talking about minimizing openings, replacement of sheetrock and surrounding area, right? You're not just replacing a pipe, you're oftentimes going to need to replace flooring or walls afterward. So creating, again, a holistic sense like the flooding, it's not just an isolated thing, it's part of a whole building ecosystem. So creating the understanding on that, and then helping folks know how to handle it. New electrical systems can be the same thing, right? Putting a server, real example, right? Putting in a digital training classroom in an old repair warehouse is really challenging. Sometimes the solution is to go as far as to build a building inside a building, right, to meet electrical needs. Leave that exterior intact just purely as a shell, pretty much. In less severe cases, right, we utilize existing openings or things that are easy to repair, right? So going in through masonry joints, going in through replacement windows. Areas where you've already seen impacts occur or on secondary facades is a really great place to integrate systems. And oftentimes they exist. Talking about new HVAC systems. So these are really massive mechanical systems, and they're really critical in places like VA hospitals or, you know, top secret facilities. You got to have a good one. So getting these in and working in historic buildings is a sensitive undertaking. You can kind of disguise them as structural elements, box them in things like creating drop ceilings that mirror historic ones, or symmetry and ducting are all good solutions to help integrate these. New mechanical systems. There's an Army Ready program, right, where we have to put these gigantic HVAC systems and generators into these buildings. This is where secondary facades come into play, right? So we're introducing these expert level concepts for people to utilize in their everyday. We want people to be able to come to CRMs, folks with solutions, and empowered with base knowledge. So if you already have new systems somewhere, that space is already altered, it's already compromised, right? So it's a great candidate to put in other new things. You know, I always like to point out previously altered spots too, for I know the Army has the fitness pods for individual units, right? Those shipping container gyms that can be dropped in place. Spaces like this are a great opportunity for that as well, or parking lots. Parking lots are a new and altered space oftentimes. And then anti-terrorism force protection, right? Since September 11th, this is a huge conversation. So security in our buildings can be integrated in a sensitive way. So making sure that these additions are, you know, put in compatible colors instead of safety yellow. This has like a vaguely Gothic vibe to it, right? It's not just chain link and razor wire at the top. You know, when you have large permanent constructions like this, you can mount them primarily into mortar joints instead of masonry units. That's another really great way to minimize harm to the historic building. And because this is a sympathetic design that's mounted into something like masonry joints, you can absolutely pass this through the Section 106 process with no adverse effect, right? There are ways to design into a lack of harm. ADA additions are a really common one as well. So the Americans with Disabilities Act is pretty new. It's from the 90s, and it's really important. that we provide equitable access to our spaces for our veterans, our instructors. You know, the DoD has people with different mobile abilities. We need to accommodate them. So when we do ADA additions, first and foremost, we try to minimize adverse for potential effects, and then we try to minimize the loss of historic fabric. And we try to match the style of the building. And so that can be, you know, if you have a cast stone building, you know, putting in a color matched concrete ramp. People often say, oh, well, you know, historic buildings didn't have safety rails. It's like, well, yes, but they did have precedent for fencing. So oftentimes I look to fencing as a place of inspiration when I have to put in safety railings and things like that. So ball and tube is a really great option. And then there's also a really fantastic preservation brief on this as well. You know, if you've got a federal style building, symmetry is a huge part of that type of design, right? So keeping it symmetrical when you create that ADA ramp is really critical, as opposed to if you were altering like a Queen Anne or something, right? You might have a little bit more latitude there, or a mid-century building where symmetry isn't quite as critical to the design. So again, first and foremost, understand the character defining features of your resource, and that's going to help you come up with the best possible and most efficient situation. You know, and if you can't match design elements due to budget constraints or whatever, right, it's important to be able to get people in and out of your building safely. That's the primary need. And so on the left, we see an ADA ramp here that's gone in. It was a previously made opening. The materials that were placed in are softer than the historic materials, right? They're breathable, so they'll move with the building. So we're meeting the need and we're not harming the historic materials in the process. So moving on to day 3. We get off with the rules again, and then we talk about everything that we've learned, and then we dive into an exercise. And this exercise is given instead of a test. I hate tests. Not everyone does well on standardized tests, and we ultimately want this to be an integrated process and project. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the exercise we did on day 2, where we talked about the process, and we're going to take our learnings from that and everything we've learned from reading our technical preservation briefs, walking tours and lectures, and break into groups. Depends on the size of your class, that dictates the size of the group. And from a hat, I have them pull a common issue and a historic building on their campus. So it could be, you know, an HVAC addition in the old DPW headquarters, or new electrical in the old fire station. They don't know what they're going to get. And then it's up to them to work as a group to identify and write out the work order. So they're going to write out a work order in their work order system. And they're going to, you know, reference any special additional information. So again, practicing things like specificity that we had identified as a whole, maybe even referencing a preservation brief, like giving who it's going to a head start, you know, letting them know if it's a historic significant building. Sometimes we don't know that, but, you know, even dropping in a simple note that's like, building may be historic, please check with real property first, right? Letting folks know that there may be special considerations, even if you don't know personally. Again, emphasizing that it's okay to ask questions and who you would go to ask. And then they hand their work order off to the group next to them. And then that group discusses the work order and presents how from cradle to grave they would execute this repair using historic preservation best methods. And so the end is kind of a mini presentation by staff members showing off all of their cool new logic and lines of communication that they have. This is really great. It's really active. It's really engaging. Oftentimes we still have the flow process up from the day before. I bring copies of technical preservation briefs printed out in case folks need to reference them for this portion or want to take them back. This is a really great time to bring in things like your iCrimp or any other design guidelines that you may have that could potentially help inform the creation of this work order. We want to give, this is like the final hurrah to give everyone a chance to synthesize what they've learned and utilize in real time all of those materials that we've given them. So then we reiterate key takeaways, right? Why do we do this? Because it's a law. It's not a suggestion, it's a law. We talk about, kind of key ethos. We reinforce team values, and then we point them to the person in their environment who will be able to, help them out, point them in the right direction, usually the CRM. And then we finish it out with a tour. So I put my information up, and we go on out into the environment, and we have a local presenter kind of talk about a space that's special to the installation, right? So closing out with a space of this space matters, something fun, something outdoors, a little decompression moment. And with that, that is the end of my presentation. So I'm going to hand it out to the group for questions and comments now.
Thank you, Lys.
Absolutely.
And for those of you who are joining us late, this is going to be posted on the DENX website under Culture Resources, under News and Outreach. So if you joined too late, just keep in mind that you can go back and watch this again to catch up what you missed. Lys, how often are these training sessions? I might have missed this, so I apologize. How often are these training sessions offered?
Great question. So this was our pilot year, and it went so well that West Point has decided to do this annually. So we go out once a year and teach this course. We also do a similar training at Lake Washington Ship Canal with our operations and maintenance staff out there. So it depends on the need and scale of the installation, but once a year seems to be the standard.
All right, so we've got a bunch of questions, and Chris, I hope, like I said, this presentation is going to be recorded, so you can watch it again to see the slides. We had a question, where might we find the technical preservation briefs?
Yes.
I guess somebody already posted about that. My apologies. If I'm going to ask right now, if anybody has any questions, you can certainly come off of mute and ask your questions to Lys.
And I'm going to stop presenting so I can see people's faces and names, if that's okay, as they ask questions.
Kelsey asks, is it possible to request training at additional locations, and how would it be funded?
Yes, it is possible to have us train anywhere you want us to. We are project funded, so it would be up to you and your organization to determine how to best do that. If it's tied into the Section 106 process, operations and maintenance trainings can be asked for as part of mitigation measures sometimes, or it can be built into ongoing staff education. There's lots of different avenues for that, but just work with your manager within your systems to figure that out.
And then we has training been provided to West Point maintenance staff on historic repair techniques? That's a great question.
Yes, so that is part of the training. So again, this was a flyby overview. We do talk about specifics and techniques in this training course. We also are going to be bringing in local experts next year to do hands-on presentations of techniques for common issues. So I think we're looking at fieldstone and door refinishing.
Is training extended to address preservation of historic furnishings?
Ooh, fun question. I teach a prospect course where we talk about historic fixtures and furnishings. We absolutely can talk about that if it's an issue that you're facing. There is guidance that can be provided on that. There are period appropriate furnishings that we can point to. Yes. It was not part of this training session, though.
Kristen Mountjoy, can you unmute yourself?
Sure. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
This is a great presentation. Oh my gosh, I loved everything about this presentation. So I'm glad it will be available for GARD folks that missed it. But my question is there any sort of plans to have maybe a resource site where installations or service branches can like maybe identify like preservation specialists in masonry and historic window repair? I know that for a lot of our states in the GARD, and when I was working in a state GARD setting, it's sometimes hard to find those regional experts in historic preservation, and you know, having sort of sometimes SHPOs will provide them, sometimes they don't. But if there was some way that the military could provide, hey, these are resources that we've used and found, you know, they're either trained to actually do the repair maintenance work, or they can provide the training / repair maintenance work for specific types of historic materials.
Yeah, that's a really fantastic question. And unfortunately, there is not a DoD-wide resource that I am aware of that offers that list. That's because I think it can get a little bit tricky and bump into some challenges, not only with regionality, but also the discussion around sole sourcing as well. I wish we had a centralized list. That would be amazing. Your SHPO is really your first line in that discussion. If they don't have resources they can help you with, oftentimes there are friends or specialty groups out there in the state that can help you find those resources as well. So if the SHPO doesn't have answers, hopefully they can point you to someone who does. If not, give me a call. I can devote 30 minutes to helping you look for someone or something. I'm happy to do that.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Okay, so Susan asked, do you have an example of oh my goodness, my tongue is tied. Oh my gosh. PAs, sorry,
Yep.
I'm going to shorten it. PAs that allow local maintenance to do and oversee repairs, or do you need an architectural historian to review all work plans and work?
That is a fabulous question. PAs are great, and they are a great way to create a sense of ownership and empowerment with O&M staff. We have one out here on the West Coast for the Federal Hydropower Project. We call it the FCRPS program. We love a good acronym. That has coverage for all of the historic dams within the Columbia River, that covers operations and maintenance repairs, so life, health, safety repairs, and common maintenance activities. So they still notify the architectural historians that they're going to be doing this. And we review to make sure it's not going to cause harm. But then we are able to skip the whole Section 106 review process because it's essentially already been completed and just cover the repair with an MFR. So there's tons of efficiencies that can be gained by developing these PAs and MOAs, right? They're fantastic tools. I highly recommend them.
We just have a comment from Eva saying, yeah, I think you would run into issues with government endorsing a private entity, contracting, etc.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, you're right, Eva, right. And we run into this too. Sometimes there are really specialized solutions for historic properties, and we bump into this, and we just have to do the best we can. You know, there's little bits of special contract language we can put in there to kind of finesse those issues. I have examples of that I can share if anyone wants. A common one that I see a lot is non-ionic detergents for cleaning masonry. And then patching sandstone, right? There's kind of one player in the game there, that's Jan. And so we have to figure out how to get the right material for the repair and stick within fiscal law.
Beth asks, is the West Point training open to individuals not at West Point?
No. It's for West Point staff. Although Paul's a really nice guy. You could ask him if you could swing by if you're in the area.
Does anyone have any more questions, comments? I see Kristen made a comment back to Eva. Yes, I can see that being a situation. We just had a hard time getting even getting a list of multiple firms with certain experience specific in historic treatments.
Yeah.
We have a question. Raise their hand. Becky, you can come off of mute.
Oh, there we go. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about anti-terrorism treatment to historic buildings and that sort of threshold that you have to deal with. Maybe give an example of like a difficult situation that you've encountered and the resolution.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is something we face, you know, from the VA to an installation basis. Common things I see that impact historic areas, districts in particular, are tree removal, security fencing, and blast-proof windows. So all of these have the potential to cause adverse effect to historic properties. Ultimately, we all work within the military structure, and so we support mission first. We don't work in a bubble. The Section 106 process requires us to consider effects, but it doesn't require us to not do a project, right? So this is when we really, really lean back hard on what is our mission, what is the scope of work, and what do the regs say? Always base yourself within a legal framework and realize we're part of a whole ecosystem here. So I have seen we'll take blast-proof windows. I've seen a range of successful solutions and less successful solutions. So the gut reaction here that oftentimes does cause an adverse effect, either through moisture intrusion or change of character, is putting vinyl windows in where historic wood ones or aluminum ones had been that were really kind of set in place. Frequently, when we do those joints, you know, it opens up, you know, room for moisture to get in when we're changing the way these new hyper-engineered materials interact with these historic ones. My favorite example is in a brutalist building, actually up at Libby Dam, where we just are changing out the whole glass, right? So we're putting in blast-proof, fire-proof glass, and we're keeping the original opening intact. Another really great solution that I've seen is the addition of an an interior storm window that can have insulating properties, you know, soundproofing and blast-proof properties as well, right? So we leave the exterior character intact, we're not changing the size of the opening, and we're meeting the new security needs of the building through an interior addition. I'm done now.
Okay. We have 2 questions that popped up. Chris asks, can this training be extended to DPW Cultural Resource Department?
Yes, I think this would be a perfect place to do DPW. We worked with Fort Leavenworth on their historic treatment guidelines, and it was really similar to this. But yeah, I think it would be really applicable to the DPW environment. I come from JV Alums DPW before this role, so yeah. Yes, I think there's a lot we could integrate and teach each other and celebrate.
Okay. Deborah asked, I work with a historic property owned by the U.S. Coast Guard. Is there a similar resource like your office for the Department of Homeland Security / U.S. Coast Guard properties?
I don't know, but the Coast Guard can hire me. So like I said, I can work with any historic or any federal resource. So we work with the EPA, we work with FEMA, we work with for the VA. Yeah. So I don't know who else is out there. I can help you look if you'd like, but you can also talk to me and I can help you.
Frank, if you want to come off of mute, I think we might end with your question.
Great, thank you. I had it typed out, but I accidentally deleted it, so it's better just to ask. And so I'm at Puget Sound Naval Shipyard in Bremerton, and our installation is half Navy base, half Naval Shipyard industrial area. Is there any differences in expectations for historical preservation between historical facilities in an industrial site versus historical buildings like just on a functional Navy base that's non-industrial? Because it seems like at Bremerton, the facilities on the naval side of the base have been maintained much more sensitive to the historical components, whereas the historical facilities within the industrial shipyard portion have just been beat up so bad over the years and modified beyond recognition with very little or no sensitivity to their original historical characteristics. And it just seems like there's not a lot of emphasis put on.
Frank, are you still there? I think you just cut out.
So I'll answer that question, Frank. We do treat historic properties differently depending on what they're significant for, right? Not every historic property is significant because of its architecture. Sometimes it's significant for patterns of planning, right? So how the buildings are laid out, or, you know, in the case of a shipyard, their proximity to the water, right? And patterns of use, right? So industrial function is what's significant about it. And so as long as industrial functionality is maintained, then it's potentially no adverse effect even when there are additions. I see a lot of really great examples of that kind of thinking and treatment with the DOT as well. So why a historic property is significant also plays a big role in how we repair, maintain, and treat it. And I am right down the road from you. I'm presenting from Bremerton today.
All right, I think we're going to end there right a minute before 2 o'clock. So I want to say thank you for everyone joining. If you have any additional questions, I would say please feel free to email our lovely technical expert here, Lys Perhay, with your additional questions. And thank you, Lys, so much for joining us and doing this presentation. We had quite the turnout today, so thank you, thank you, thank you. And thank you to everyone else who joined and had some great questions and comments for Lys. And with that, we'll end here. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you for attending and this opportunity.
Thank you.